Hello and welcome to Personalized Learning in an It's All About Me world. My name is Jessica Parnell. I am CEO of Edivate Learning Corp, and I am proud to be here in a community of world changers. You are a community that is dealing with educational options that didn't even exist 5 years ago. I count it a privilege to speak with you who are devoting your lives and your hearts and your minds to somebody else's kids. It's not easy, and I thank you both as a parent and as a fellow educator. I'm recording this at a time when parents are realizing the incredible value that you as teachers bring. As they wrestle with how to provide this education from home, and as you struggle with how to provide meaningful learning opportunities from home, our parents are seeing the incredible value of teachers. And our students, this generation IY, is struggling to figure out just exactly how to approach learning. And this is an unprecedented time and opportunity for us to truly build in personalized learning opportunities. And I'm excited to share some of these ideas with you. The format of this session is going to be a little bit different than is typical because we're meeting strictly online, but I will do my best to keep things moving and deliver the content that you came looking for. Let's start by talking about who is this It's All About Me generation. Often termed Generation IY, this is the generation that has grown up with iTunes, iPhones, iChat, iMovie, iPads, iPods. They're very much consumers. They're not necessarily contributors yet. And what we're seeing in the other side in the workforce is that the kids are coming out ill-equipped for the workforce. And so we as educators have the job of getting them ready. But what is interesting is our job is quite a challenge because this is the first time, the first generation that doesn't need adults to get information. But our job as adults is to help them make sense of what they know, help them to process that information that they're accessing on those devices. This is also the first generation that can access information on anything they want to know right now. Simple search and they can find what they want to know. If you were to stop this recording for just a moment and type in the topic of the last lesson you delivered into Google, you would find page after page after page of results. And that's what our students have access to. These students will learn more from their portable device than a classroom. So we as teachers are more than likely going to shift to monitoring the speed at which all students are learning, but every student is learning at their own speed, and our challenge will be to take that learning beyond simply accessing information and helping them to process it, make sense of it, and then get creative with it. These are the children that use a phone instead of a wristwatch, instead of a camera, instead of a wall calendar, an alarm clock, roadmap. They wouldn't even know how to follow a roadmap today, and even board game. Their device handles all of those daily interactions and needs. This is also the first generation that can broadcast their every thought or emotion as soon as they feel them. They're in social contact at all times, yet they're often in isolation. So they are a social generation. They're not very good with people, but they're very social. Their emotional intelligence has not been developed yet, and that development is slowing down. They also enjoy external stimuli at their fingertips 24/7. So the question is, are they developing internal motivation? And last, they're the first generation where we honestly cannot say that we know what they're going through. And that's a big change. But what's the outcome? The outcome is that we as adults have actually enabled them to become very narcissistic. Everyone's a winner. You are amazing. You are awesome. Bumper stickers that say, my kid is a super kid. This is a generation that is super into themselves. And yet, all of this buildup doesn't build self-esteem. It's built narcissism. And we'll talk about what builds self-esteem a little bit later in the workshop. 94% say the number one word they would use to describe their life is overwhelmed. 44% say they're so overwhelmed it's difficult to function. And 1 in 10 have considered suicide. This is the outcome of this IY generation, this IY scene. How do we prepare this generation for the future? This is a generation that is so often sheltered, but they feel pressured. They're self-absorbed, and yet they're very generous, right? They care about social causes. They're social, and yet they're isolated by the technology, and that's why their emotional intelligence is very low. They're very adventuresome, but they're fearful. They may go jump off a cliff, but they're not going to make the commitments that they need to move things forward. Their world is full of speed, and therefore this generation IY tends to assume that slow is bad. Their world is full of convenience, And so they start to assume that hard is bad. It's full of entertainment. And so they start to believe that boring is bad. Now we know every generation has felt that boring is bad, but this generation is having trouble navigating that. Their world is full of nurture, and therefore they think that risks are bad. And it's full of entitlement, and therefore they think that labor is bad. These are the assumptions that the Generation IY are making about the world around them. Their orientation is high achievement, and yet they're very high maintenance. They're growing up too fast and too slow at the same time because they are exposed to so much early on. Online, in preschool, they're being exposed to more than many of us were exposed to in our middle school years, but they're slowing down in maturity. There was a study recently that stated that 26 is the new 18. And so we're seeing adolescence expanding on both sides, coming down earlier and going later. So as we look about preparing this generation for the future, educators have turned to personalized education. Now, personalized education is not new. In fact, I grew up in a school where personalized education was the norm, and I graduated in 1986. But what is the current definition of personalized education? It's defined by a number of different organizations. So I just pulled a definition from Aurora Institute, which was formerly INACOL. And what they state is that personalized learning is tailoring learning for each student's strengths, needs, and interests, including enabling student voice and choice in what, how, when, and where they learn, to provide flexibility and supports to ensure mastery of the highest standards possible. I would suggest that the ultimate goal of personalized education is not mastery, although that is very important, but it's inspiration. It's about nurturing each individual's creative genius. And why is that so important? Years ago, we all know NASA had a vision to put a man on the moon. And as they were ramping up, they wanted to identify some way to identify the most creative people in their organization. So they went and they hired George Land, a scientist, to create a simple assessment that would measure someone's creativity. And they applied it to all the people throughout NASA, from not just the scientists and engineers, but their administrative people, project managers, and so forth. And they were able to identify those employees who scored at the creative genius level. And once they had identified them, they moved those people to where their creativity could be applied. And we put a man on the moon and got them safely back only 7 years after they started. If you think about that, that's a pretty amazing accomplishment. But even more important is that you think about all the amazing discoveries that have come out of NASA, from scratch-resistant lenses to aircraft anti-icing systems, vascular heart bypass operations, solar panels, infrared ear thermometers. These are all innovations that have come from this creative group of NASA geniuses. So what if personalization is about unleashing creativity? What if it means students who find their creativity and spend their time growing and nurturing that creativity? But how do we define creative genius? So George Land defined it as the ability to look at a problem and come up with new, different, and innovative ideas. At the age of 13, Picasso's painting ability had far outmastered that of his father's, who taught art at the School of Fine Arts. That same year, his father convinced the school to let Picasso apply. The entrance exam and the portfolio requirements typically took a month to complete. Picasso completed them in a day. His talent was extraordinary. His early work was so revered that it made him very successful, and he could have continued to pursue that form of art. But here's the part that matters. Instead of painting more of what would certainly have made him wealthy, Picasso intentionally pursued growth. He pioneered an astounding 14 different periods of paintings. He also did ceramics, sculpture, engravings, costume design, and wrote poetry. Each time Picasso ventured into a new area, he was starting out as a beginner. When Picasso said to find is the thing, he was describing really the very essence of his life. He spent his life continuously finding. And where did all of his discovery leave him? Well, Picasso has 29,000 catalog works of art, and 2 of his works of art are in the top 10 most expensive paintings ever sold. Picasso said, "I am always doing that which I cannot do, in order that I may learn how to do it. Picasso intentionally developed his genius. How? By continuously creating. So what if our personalized educational environment was such that it encourages our students to pursue, quote, what I cannot do? What if our students made the pursuit of creativity their primary thing? It wasn't until the late 1700s that we began to apply a grade to students' academic work. So our brains are wired to believe that there is a numeric value in everything our students do. And perhaps that is part of what has led us to depart from this pursuit of creativity. Now, I know there are some of you sitting here today saying, wait a minute. There are things they need to know. There are skills that they have to acquire. Basic foundational elements that they cannot miss. I agree with you. I'm with you. Our students need those foundations. But let's go back to George Lamb for just a moment. You see, as scientists, George and his team were not satisfied with simply identifying creativity. They wanted to solve the bigger question. Where does creativity come from? Are some people born with it, or is it learned? So they created a second study. This one included 1,600 5-year-olds. That's right, 5-year-olds. And this was a test of that ability to look at a problem and come up with new, different, and innovative ideas. And what do you think the percentage of 5-year-olds fell into what you might call the genius category? Well, hopefully you aimed high because the information was so surprising. Of the 5-year-olds tested, 98% tested in the genius category. In fact, that information was so surprising that they decided to turn it into a longitudinal study and tested them again at 10 years old. Before I reveal, take a guess at what you believe was the percent of 10-year-olds who scored in that creative genius level. Well, the results had dropped down to an astounding 30%. 30% of 10-year-olds scored in the creative genius level. Of course, they had to do it again. At the age of 15, they came back and they looked at the same group of students at the age of 15. And what they found was that there were only 12% of those 15-year-olds that scored in the creative genius level. At this point, everybody was so depressed, they stopped running the longitudinal study. But they have tested thousands and thousands of Americans, including those in Nassau. And what percent of adults do you believe scored in the creative genius level? Surprisingly, only 2% of adults scored, both at Nassau and in subsequent studies, scored in that creative genius level. It's sort of funny because the great historian Oswald Spengler once said that in all his years of studying history, he found that it only takes about 2% of the population to create the basic ideas, and then everybody else applies them. It turned out that he was pretty close to right. But rather than be discouraged by these numbers, we want to stop as educators and say, what can we do to help nurture that creative genius, that ability to look at a problem and come up with new, different, and innovative ideas? How in the world do we educate this generation in a way that prepares them for a successful future? We're no longer an industrial country. In fact, third world countries around the world can produce just as well as we can. So as we look at the needs of this next generation, that ability to be innovative is essential for success. So how do we, as educators, stop this loss of creativity? I don't think personalization at the heart is about finding easier ways to learn, although that's what many students seem to think. It's not about finding less boring ways to learn. It's not necessarily about different ways to demonstrate knowledge, although all of these things are byproducts of personalized learning. But it's about designing learning that's longer lasting, that's more motivating and more empowering for all in a world where information is at their fingertips. And that is the challenge of you, of today's educator. We've been around long enough that there are times slow is necessary. We've been around to know that hard is good, boring can be navigated, risks are the path to success, and work is essential. But how do we help our students embrace that? More importantly, what does all this have to do with the neuroscience of learning? Well, let's dive into that subject. I want to just give you an overview of the different regions of the brain that are key to creative thinking and innovation, creative learning. And these are the parts of our brain that our students will have to learn to rely on as they move from regurgitation and demonstration of skills and knowledge of facts to the ability to innovate and solve problems. The first is your prefrontal cortex. This is the hub, or really kind of the center of creativity, as it seems to be responsible for many of the functions that contribute to creative thinking, such as working memory, imagination, problem solving. All of our conscious thought happens here in the prefrontal cortex. In fact, it is the part of our brain that we rely on the most for those daily operations of setting goals, planning, controlling impulses. And yet it is also the part of our brain that is the most energy sapping. So our prefrontal cortex is an essential part of our brain. And when we're teaching, this is the part of our student's brain that has to first access and process that information that they're gleaning from us or from online or whatever instrument they're utilizing to learn. Another part of our brain essential to learning is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is best known from the memory of things that you can declare, such as facts and experiences. And basically, the processes that the hippocampus performs is to process these memories, storing and retrieving the pieces of information of those memories from where they're stored in the cortex. So in the creative process, it's similar to remembering experiences by pulling together different parts of that experience. The hippocampus may also be used in imagination as the prefrontal cortex pulls together ideas in ways that you've never thought of in the past. The hippocampus is also part of the limbic system, which can usurp the learning process when emotions flare, which we'll learn about in just a moment. Another part of our brain essential to creativity is the basal ganglia. Why? Because this is the structure deep within our brain that processes the memory of school skills and how to do them. It often manages the things that we don't have to think about directly, such as riding a bike, driving to a place that we typically go to every day, multiplication facts if we've stored them into memory. With time and practice doing creative tasks, you can get better at them. And the more we practice, the more those actions become part of our habits and routine. And the basal ganglia is much more energy efficient and therefore can drive those operations much faster and more efficiently. And then there's the neural pathways. These are the connections between our brain structures. And we are developing new neural pathways every single day. The better connected the areas of the brain are, the better and faster the brain can process information. So in the creative process, having a well-connected brain allows our students to bring together more ideas more quickly. And we do that through practice. And last, the limbic system. As I mentioned, the limbic system is the part of our brain that manages our emotions. And this can be the motivator behind creativity or behind learning, or the usurper. Because when the limbic system experiences a negative emotion, it significantly affects the ability to think. But when it approaches learning in a positive way, it creates interest and a desire to know more. So we need to be mindful of those triggers that set off the limbic system or set off emotions in our students. Because the more those emotions are triggered, the less apt they are for learning, thinking, and creativity. I also want to talk about the two forms of thinking. As we go through these two forms of thinking, think about your classroom. Because there's two forms. There's divergent thinking, which is creativity, and it utilizes all parts of the brain. And convergent thinking, which is basically making a judgment, criticizing, and evaluating. So one, the divergent, is an accelerator, and the convergent is like a brake. And as we educate our students, we tend to teach them to do both kinds of thinking at the same time. We encourage them to come up with ideas, but we start looking at those ideas immediately. We start evaluating them immediately. And inside the brain, as we do this, the neurons are fighting each other and actually diminishing the power of the brain. And so when we structure our classes, when we structure our challenges to students, we want to approach these different types of thinking in different time periods so that the one is not squashed by the other. So just want to give you a quick formula for success. First, reduce anxiety. As I mentioned, that limbic system, that emotional center of our brain, can usurp the ability to think and learn. When our emotions flare, we actually see an equal disarousal in the prefrontal cortex as the level of arousal in our emotional center. And that means that the stronger the emotion, the less able we are to think. So when we think back to this generation, where 94% of them say they are overwhelmed and they're in a state of anxiety, how well can they learn? They're struggling because of the way their brain is operating. So the number one thing we need to do is reduce anxiety. And that can be how we structure learning to how they learn best. It can be our classroom settings, managing the social bullying and the social issues that are happening in the school. It can be helping them feel encouraged about the gifts and abilities they have and less discouraged by the numbers that we place on their assignments, tests, papers, and projects. The second formula for success is to apply what I call the I, C to the third formula. So what is this formula? First, capture ideas. So when we take time to capture ideas on its own session, don't stop to evaluate those ideas, but give students an opportunity to just capture as many ideas as they can around a certain subject, endeavor, problem solving, whatever that aspect is, lots of opportunity to capture those ideas. And then withhold criticism. What we say in our working environment is we have to love it for 5 minutes. So when someone presents an idea, no matter how far-fetched, we have to discuss it and think about it and love it for 5 minutes. We withhold criticism. And instead of trying to consider how it might not work, our job is to add further creativity to that idea, to continue to allow it to evolve. If you think about that in your classroom, when a student has presented a question, an idea, a project scope, if rather than the teacher immediately having to give feedback, it becomes an exercise where fellow students can continue to help fine-tune that idea, make it more creative, more ambitious. Imagine the creativity that can occur. That's exercising creativity. And the more we can allow that, the more apt our students are, of course, to develop that muscle and to make creativity a part of their basal ganglia and what comes naturally, a habit and a routine. And last, student choice. Allowing students to have choice in how they demonstrate their knowledge can be a very effective way in encouraging the development of creativity. Because one student may find a way to present their findings in music, another may build a project, another write a paper, and still another one perhaps creates a speech or some other form or an engineering project. By giving them voice and choice, we're giving them the opportunity to showcase their gifts and abilities without changing the expectations. So the IC to the third formula is a fantastic way to continue to develop their creativity, but also allow for that personalization. Because again, our goal is to develop creative genius in our kids. Why? The benefits of creativity are vast. Creativity helps relieve stress. When we become involved in a creative process, you enter a mental state, what many term flow or the zone. And that can help reduce stress levels and keep you calm. So in an environment where our students are feeling anxiety and stress as they walk into the environment of the classroom, giving them that opportunity to harness their creativity can actually shift that mental state from anxiety to reduce stress and flow. We also know that creativity energizes us. When we pursue something we enjoy, being creative can help give us the energy because we're focusing on our attention on something we like rather than dwelling on the worries or bothers of the day. So if we can give our students that opportunity, we also watch and see them become more and more energized by learning. It helps our emotions. As you've noticed, music therapy, dance therapy, art therapy, these are all creative outlets that are being used with patients with different emotional disorders, including depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Why? Because by being creative, you can work through your own emotions and feelings. It also increases your empathy and tolerance. So as students view art, we've seen that increase their feelings of empathy and tolerance towards other people who are different from themselves. And by being creative and pursuing creative activities, they can learn more about the people around them by interacting with students around them. It also increases brain plasticity. Your brain makes connections and changes throughout your lifetime. So creating art can stimulate communication between different parts of the brain, and having a well-connected brain is thought to be more important for things such as intelligence than the sheer size of various brain structures. So creativity increases those connections. Lots of benefits to the pursuit of creative genius as a formula for our personalized learning. Now, Elefango has made this creative pursuit its mission. Our desire is to create a curriculum companion that allows students to approach learning that fits their personality, their learning style, it fits their interests, and it gives them the opportunity for choice and voice because they drive the learning in Elefango. Teachers can also easily assign lessons to students by personality style, learning style. Even this type of lesson, from a skill sharpener to a dig deeper lesson, can really help tailor and personalize learning to each different student. It is designed with the neuroscience of learning in mind, and it is designed to continue to encourage students' curiosity. And in today's world where we're looking for ways to go remote, how do we offer digital learning to our students in this time of upheaval in our country? Elefango can be a great resource. And we are offering Elefango to schools who are facing school closure absolutely free for a full year. so your teachers can adopt it in confidence, knowing that the lessons they assign today will be there tomorrow, even if school's back in session. I encourage you to visit elefango.com/coronavirus for this free school or classroom offer. Just visit elefango.com/coronavirus and sign up your school or classroom today. Elefango.com is the perfect answer to this need to find remote options that teachers can implement easily, that provide the personalization you're looking for, and that give students voice and choice in what they're doing while they're at home. So I encourage you once again, elefango.com/coronavirus. Thank you.